The doctors laughed at her for being just a nurse in that luxury hospital, but it was she who noticed the error that no one else could see. When the millionaire worsened before everyone's eyes, only one person had the courage to act. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. Continuing. St. Jude's Medical Center was among the most prestigious in Chicago. Its immaculate white walls reflected not just light, but status. There, every corridor exhaled competence, every office boasted international diplomas, and every doctor carried in their chest the certainty of belonging to an elite that few could reach. It was a place where excellence was not just expected, it was demanded, and where money bought not only treatment, but reverence. Sarah Miller knew that world well. For 15 years she had worked at the hospital, always behind the scenes, always discreet. Her steps were silent through the corridors of the intensive care unit, her hands precise when checking vital signs, her presence constant but invisible to anyone who didn't really want to look. To the doctors, she was part of the scenery. To the patients, a comforting shadow. To herself, a constant reminder of what could have been. On that Tuesday morning, the movement in the hospital took on a different rhythm. The arrival of Edward Sterling was announced with the discretion reserved for the very wealthy, but with the urgency that only serious cases justify. A well-known businessman in Chicago's financial circles, owner of a holding company that controlled everything from construction firms to technology networks, Edward was the type of man accustomed to commanding boardrooms with a single look. Now, however, he was being wheeled in on a stretcher, his face pale, his body visibly debilitated. Sarah was organizing paperwork at the nursing station when she heard the hurried footsteps and the controlled voices of the doctors. She looked up and saw the commotion around room 23. She immediately recognized Dr. Henry Bradford, the head of the clinical team, a man in his late 50s whose impeccable resume was surpassed only by his unshakable certainty that he was always right. Beside him, other specialists moved with the rehearsed choreography of those who know they are being watched. Edward was transferred to the bed with care. Sarah noticed the excessive paleness, the slightly accelerated breathing, the sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. From the fragments of conversation she managed to catch, the situation was confusing. Extreme fatigue, intermittent abdominal pain, episodes of mental confusion. Preliminary exams pointed to nothing conclusive. They ruled out serious infection, acute heart problems, and obvious kidney complications. But something was clearly wrong. During the first few days, Sarah followed the case from a distance. Her work kept her close enough to observe, but far enough away not to interfere with medical decisions. Edward received constant attention, battery after battery of tests, consultations with specialists from different fields, heated discussions about diagnostic hypotheses, and even so, he continued to get worse. On Thursday, when Sarah entered the room to check his vital signs, she found Edward awake, but visibly exhausted. He watched her with tired eyes, as if trying to understand why yet another person was there to touch his arms, measure his blood pressure, and write down numbers that made no difference to how he felt. Sarah worked in silence, efficient as always, but she noticed his gaze following her movements. "You're different from the others," he said suddenly, his voice raspy. "You don't keep explaining what you're doing to me as if I were a child." Sarah didn't expect him to speak. She looked up briefly, met his gaze, and answered naturally. "You don't seem to need explanations, Mr. Sterling. Just rest." Edward almost smiled, but the effort seemed too great. "Rest, that's what they all say. But no one knows what I actually need, not even them." He was referring to the doctors, Sarah knew. She finished recording the data and put away the equipment. "They will find out," she said, without much conviction in her voice. "Do you believe that?" Edward asked, fixing her with a gaze more penetrating than expected for someone so debilitated. Sarah hesitated. "I believe they are good at what they do, but sometimes the answers aren't where we usually look." Edward remained silent, processing those words. Before he could respond, the door opened and Dr. Bradford entered, accompanied by 2 residents. Sarah immediately moved away, returning to her position of invisibility. The doctor didn't even look at her. "Mr. Sterling, I brought the MRI results. Let's talk about the next steps." Sarah left the room, but the conversation echoed in her mind. During the rest of her shift, she mentally reviewed everything she had observed. Edward's symptoms were inconsistent. Some hours he seemed to improve, gained a little color, regained lucidity, but then, seemingly at random, he would get worse again. The fluctuations didn't follow the pattern of any known disease she could recognize. On Saturday, the situation worsened. Edward had an episode of severe disorientation during the night. He woke up confused, with tremors in his hands, and difficulty articulating complete sentences. The medical team was called urgently. New tests were requested. Hypotheses were raised and discarded with the same speed. Sarah was on duty and witnessed everything: the controlled agitation of the doctors, the poorly disguised concern on the faces of the younger nurses. It was during that night that Sarah really began to pay attention to the details, not just Edward's symptoms, but everything around him. Who entered the room, when they entered, what they brought. There was a routine, of course: doctors, nurses, lab technicians, but there were also visitors. One woman especially caught her attention: Victoria Langford, introduced as Edward's long-time business partner. She appeared every day, always with fresh flowers, always with an elegant handbag, always with a worried but controlled smile. Sarah observed her bringing a natural juice to Edward on Sunday morning. He drank some, thanked her with a nod, and Victoria left shortly after, promising to return in the afternoon. 2 hours later, Edward had another episode of malaise, this time accompanied by intense nausea. The next day, Sarah noticed the pattern repeating. Victoria would bring something: a drink, a fruit, a home-prepared tea. Edward would consume it, and invariably, a few hours later, he would show signs of worsening. It could be a coincidence. It probably was. But Sarah had learned over the years that coincidences in hospitals were rarely just that. She tried to recall everything she knew about poisoning. She had studied pharmacology back when she still dreamed of being a doctor, before everything fell apart, before the unjust accusation that forced her out of medical school, before she had to start over as a nursing technician, before she accepted that her place would always be there, in support, never on the front lines. But the knowledge remained stored somewhere in her memory, waiting to be useful. Natural compounds could mimic serious diseases. Some were practically undetectable by conventional tests, especially if no one was specifically looking for them. They could cause neurological and gastrointestinal symptoms and extreme fatigue, and they could be administered in a disguised way in small and repeated doses, creating a progressive condition that confused even the best diagnosticians. Sarah shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was an absurd theory. She was seeing things where there were none. Victoria was just a concerned friend. The doctors knew what they were doing. She was just too tired, working double shifts, letting her imagination run wild. But then, the following Tuesday, while helping to change the sheets on Edward's bed, she noticed something. A slight change in his pupils, a subtle dilation that shouldn't be there, and his skin, to the touch, had a strangely dry texture, inconsistent with the level of hydration he had been receiving. They were small, almost imperceptible signs, but they were there. She decided she had to speak up. She couldn't simply ignore what she was seeing. She waited for the right moment when Dr. Bradford was making rounds with the team. She approached carefully, respectful, using the most professional tone she could muster. "Doctor, excuse me. I would like to comment on something regarding the patient in room 23. Bradford looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and slight irritation. "Sarah, I have observed some patterns in Mr. Sterling's symptoms. There seems to be a correlation between the episodes of worsening and specific moments in the routine. I believe it would be important to consider the possibility of exposure to an external substance." The doctor frowned. "External substance? What exactly are you talking about?" Sarah felt all the eyes of the team on her. The residents exchanged glances. One of the younger nurses looked down, embarrassed. Sarah took a deep breath and continued. "I am suggesting that perhaps we should investigate poisoning by compounds that don't appear in routine exams. Some plants, for example, can cause neurological and gastrointestinal symptoms that mimic other conditions." The silence that followed was heavy. Bradford crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "Sarah, I appreciate your dedication, but diagnosis is not your area of expertise. We have a highly qualified team taking care of this case. Poisoning has already been ruled out. The toxicology tests were negative. But there are substances that don't show up in those tests, Sarah insisted, feeling the ground become dangerous beneath her feet. If we could do more specific tests, or at least better control what the patient consumes. Control what he consumes. Bradford's voice rose slightly in tone. Are you suggesting that someone on the staff is poisoning the patient? No, I didn't say that. I'm just... Sarah, your job here is to check vital signs and ensure the patient's comfort. Leave the diagnosis to those who studied medicine, and the next time you have a theory, perhaps it would be better to keep it to yourself. We don't want to create unnecessary panic or embarrassment for Mr. Sterling's visitors. The humiliation was direct, public, and irreversible. Sarah felt her face burn. The residents looked away. The young nurse bit her lip. Bradford was already turning away, considering the matter closed, when Sarah heard a weak voice coming from the room next to them. Let her speak. Everyone turned. Edward was at the door of his room, leaning on his IV pole, his face still pale, but his eyes fixed on the group. He staggered slightly, and Sarah instinctively took a step forward, but he raised his hand, asking her to stop. If she has something to say about my case, I want to hear it. Bradford opened his mouth to protest, but Edward cut him off with a look. After all, I'm the one dying here, aren't I? So perhaps I have the right to choose who can weigh in on it. The silence returned, but this time with a different quality. Edward looked directly at Sarah, and she felt something change between them. It wasn't trust yet. It was curiosity. It was the perception that perhaps, just perhaps, she was seeing something that everyone else had chosen to ignore. Sarah swallowed hard but didn't look away. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I will continue to observe. Edward nodded slightly, and then allowed the nurses to help him back into the room. Bradford cast one last warning look at Sarah before following the team. But something had changed, and Sarah knew she could no longer pretend she wasn't seeing what was right before her eyes. That night, as she finished her shift, she began to write everything down. Times, symptoms, visitors, food consumed, every detail, no matter how small. If she was wrong, no one needed to know. But if she was right, those notes might be the only chance to save Edward Sterling's life. And deep down, a part of her that had long been dormant began to wake up, the part that once dreamed of making a difference, the part that didn't accept ready-made answers, the part that, despite everything, still believed that truth mattered more than hierarchies. Edward went back to sleep that night, but his dreams were restless, and for the first time since he'd arrived at the hospital, he found himself thinking not of the renowned doctors around him, but of the woman with the attentive gaze that everyone seemed determined to ignore. The days following the confrontation with Dr. Bradford brought Sarah a discreet but constant vigilance. She learned to observe without appearing to observe, to take mental notes without raising suspicion, to be present without drawing attention. It was a skill she had developed over the years, the art of being invisible even while being at the center of everything. Edward continued to get worse. The episodes of mental confusion became more frequent, the abdominal pain more intense, the fatigue almost absolute. In the morning, he could barely keep his eyes open. In the afternoon, when he seemed to gather some strength, a cup of tea or a glass of juice was enough for everything to start over hours later. And Victoria kept appearing, always helpful, always with something prepared specifically for him. Sarah began to pay attention to Victoria as well. The woman was around 40, her dark hair always tied in an elegant bun, wearing impeccable clothes that screamed money without exaggeration. She spoke with a soft, almost maternal voice, and treated Edward with a mixture of affection and efficiency that could seem genuine to someone not looking for something else. But Sarah was, and the more she observed, the more uneasy she became. There was something too rehearsed in Victoria's gestures. The way she arranged the flowers in the vase, always changing the water with excessive care. The way she prepared the drinks she brought, insisting that Edward drink it all, claiming they were special, organic recipes beneficial for recovery. And mainly the way she observed Edward after he consumed whatever she had brought. A gaze that was too attentive, like someone waiting for a specific reaction. On Wednesday, Sarah was organizing medications at the nursing station when she saw Victoria leave Edward's room, carrying her usual handbag. The woman passed her without a glance, but Sarah noticed something different. Victoria seemed tense, her jaw slightly clenched, her shoulders rigid. There was a haste in her steps, an urgency that hadn't been there on other days. Sarah waited a few minutes, then entered Edward's room. He was lying down, his face turned toward the window, his breathing irregular. On the small table beside the bed, there was a half-empty glass with residues of a greenish liquid. Sarah approached, pretending to check the monitors, but her eyes were fixed on the glass. "Did you drink this just now?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Edward turned his head slowly, his eyes clouded. Victoria brought it, said it was kale and ginger juice to detoxify, according to her. Sarah nodded, picked up the glass as if she were taking it to be washed, but she didn't let it go straight to the sink. When she left the room, she discreetly tucked the glass into a plastic bag and hid it at the bottom of her locker in the changing room. She didn't know yet what she would do with it, but something told her she would need that sample. 2 hours later, Edward had his worst episode yet. It began with hand tremors, followed by violent nausea and a sudden collapse in blood pressure. The medical team was called urgently. Sarah was there, helping to stabilize him, seeing the poorly disguised panic in the eyes of the residents and the growing frustration on Bradford's face. "He's deteriorating faster than we should expect," one of the doctors whispered to a colleague. None of the hypotheses make sense. Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to shake all of them and force them to see the obvious. But she knew it wouldn't work. She had already tried, and the result had been public humiliation. So she remained silent, doing her job, waiting for the right moment. It was during the night shift, when the hospital became quieter, and only the night staff moved through the corridors, that Sarah made a decision. She took the plastic bag with the stored glass and went to the lab. She knew the technician on duty well, a young man named Ryan who had always been kind to her. "Ryan, I need a favor," she said, keeping her voice low. Ryan looked up from his computer, surprised to see her there at that hour. "Sarah, is everything okay?" She placed the bag on the counter. "I need you to analyze this. Look specifically for plant compounds, alkaloids, glycosides, anything that could cause neurological and gastrointestinal symptoms but wouldn't appear in standard toxicology tests." Ryan looked at the glass, then at her. "Sarah, you know I can't do this without a medical requisition." "I know, but I'm asking anyway, as a friend, please." He hesitated, biting his lip. "Where did this come from?" "From room 23. The patient drank it a few hours before having a severe collapse." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If I get caught doing unauthorized analyses, I'll lose my job, Sarah. I know what I'm asking, and I know it's risky, but this man is dying, Ryan, and no one is seeing what I'm seeing. If I'm wrong, you throw the result away and no one ever knows. But if I'm right, you could save a life." Ryan's eyes met hers, and Sarah saw the exact moment he gave in. "Fine, I'll do it, but it'll take a few days. These analyses are complex." "Thank you." Sarah briefly squeezed his arm before leaving, carrying with her the fragile hope that she would finally have concrete proof. In the following days, Sarah intensified her observations. She wrote everything down: the times of Victoria's visits, what she brought, how long she stayed, how Edward reacted afterward, and she began to notice other details. Victoria always arrived with a large brown leather bag, and she never left it alone. When she needed to leave the room for any reason, she took the bag with her. And on the rare occasions when Edward seemed to improve, when a whole day passed without Victoria showing up, the symptoms visibly diminished. It was during one of those better afternoons that Sarah had her second real conversation with Edward. He was awake, more lucid than in recent days, and asked her to help adjust his pillows. As she did so, he lightly held her wrist, making her stop. "So you still think something is wrong, don't you?" he asked, his voice still weak but firm. "Something beyond what the doctors are saying." Sarah looked at the closed door, then back at him. "I do. And they keep ignoring you." "It's not the first time." Edward studied her face for a long moment. "There's a story there, isn't there? Something that happened before you were a nurse." Sarah hesitated. She wasn't one to talk about it, she never did. But there was something in Edward's gaze, an understanding that went beyond superficial curiosity. "I was in medical school," she said finally, her voice low. "Third year. There was an accusation. They said I had helped another student cheat on an important exam. It wasn't true, but his word was worth more than mine. I was expelled. When I tried to transfer, no one would accept me. The stain was already there. So I started over as a nursing technician and worked my way up to being a nurse, but I never managed to get back to where I was. Edward closed his eyes briefly, processing. So you know what it's like to be discredited even when you're right. I do. And yet you keep trying. Because some things matter more than the fear of being wrong, Sarah replied, and she realized it was true. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about proving the doctors wrong. It was about his life, about doing what was right, even if it came at a high cost. Edward lightly squeezed her wrist before letting go. Keep observing then, and if you need something, anything, tell me. I still have some influence, even lying here. Sarah nodded, feeling something form between them. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a beginning, a silent alliance between two people who knew what it was like to fight against systems that underestimated them. On Saturday, Ryan finally found her. He was nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he handed her a brown envelope with the results. Sarah, what you gave me to analyze has significant concentrations of compounds derived from plants of the genus Nerium. Oleander. In controlled and repeated doses, it can cause all the symptoms this patient is presenting. And the worst part is, it practically doesn't show up in conventional toxicology exams unless you're specifically looking for it. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. Oleander, a common ornamental plant, beautiful, used in gardens all over the country, and extremely toxic when ingested. It could cause cardiac arrhythmias, nausea, mental confusion, extreme weakness, and if administered gradually in small doses, it created a progressive condition that perfectly mimicked a mysterious and serious illness. Are you sure? She asked, her voice coming out in a whisper. Absolute certainty. Ryan looked around, ensuring they were alone. Sarah, this is serious. If someone is giving this to that patient on purpose, we're talking about something very grave. You need to take this to the doctors. I know, but I need to do it the right way. If I simply show up with this information, they'll ask me how I got it, and you'll get in trouble too. Ryan nodded, still pale. Whatever you're going to do, do it fast, because if they keep giving this to him, he won't last much longer. Sarah put the envelope away and spent the rest of the day thinking. She needed a strategy. She couldn't simply accuse Victoria without more solid proof. She couldn't confront Bradford without a way to explain how she obtained that analysis. But she also couldn't stand by while Edward was being systematically poisoned right under everyone's noses. The answer came from an unexpected source. On Sunday morning, while making her initial rounds, Sarah heard raised voices coming from Edward's room. It was Victoria, and for the first time, her soft voice had given way to a harder, almost threatening tone. You need to sign these documents, Edward. Don't be stubborn, it's for the good of the company. I'm not signing anything while I'm like this, Edward replied, his voice weak but determined. I'm in no condition to make important decisions. Sarah approached discreetly, pretending to organize charts in the corridor. She could hear clearly now. You're being irrational. These are just temporary transfers of control until you recover. Temporary, sure. And when I recover, if I recover, I'll find out I no longer have control over anything, won't I? There was a tense silence. Then Victoria's voice returned, more controlled, colder. You've always been paranoid, Edward. That's the illness talking. Or it's lucidity. For the first time in weeks. The door opened abruptly, and Victoria walked out, her face flushed, her bag clutched against her body. She passed Sarah without seeing her, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Sarah waited a few seconds, then entered the room. Edward was sitting up in bed, visibly shaken. She saw it. It wasn't a question. I heard, Sarah admitted. The documents, she wants control of the company. She's wanted it for a long time, but she always knew I would never give it while I was conscious. Edward looked at Sarah with sudden clarity in his eyes. Only now I'm too weak to resist. Convenient, don't you think? Very, Sarah agreed, feeling the pieces finally falling into place. Mr. Sterling, I need to tell you something, and you need to trust me when I say that what I'm about to tell you is true, even if it seems impossible. She told him everything. The observations, the patterns, the analysis of the juice, the oleander. Edward listened in silence, his face growing paler with every word. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "Victoria," he said finally, his voice heavy with a mixture of anger and something that sounded like pain. "She's poisoning me to take control of the company, and no one suspected because it looked like I was just sick." "No one wanted to see it," Sarah corrected gently, "but now we know and we can stop it." "How?" "If you take this to Bradford, he'll want to know how you got the analysis. He'll question your authority. He might even fire you for acting without permission." "I know." Sarah took a deep breath. "But there is a doctor here, Dr. Luke Montgomery. He's younger, less tied to hierarchies. I've seen him questioning some of Bradford's decisions in recent weeks. If I can convince him to investigate on his own officially, we might have a chance." Edward nodded slowly. "Do it. Talk to him and I'll do my part. I won't consume anything else Victoria brings, nothing." Sarah agreed, but a part of her knew that wouldn't be enough. Victoria had been careful so far, but if she felt she was losing control, she could become desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. That night, before finishing her shift, Sarah sought out Dr. Luke. She found him in the doctor's lounge, reviewing charts, looking tired from a shift that had been too long. He looked up when she entered, surprised. "Sarah, did something happen?" "I need to talk to you about the patient in room 23. Edward Sterling, there's something you need to investigate." Luke watched her for a long moment, and Sarah saw in him something she hadn't seen in Bradford, a willingness to listen. "Go ahead." And she spoke. She told him about the patterns, about the suspicions, about the need for more specific tests. She didn't mention the analysis Ryan had done. She presented everything as clinical observation and professional intuition. Luke listened without interrupting, his expression becoming more serious with every word. When she finished, he remained silent, thinking, "Oleander, it's a bold hypothesis, but not impossible. The symptoms match." "Will you investigate?" "I will. But you need to understand that if I'm wrong or if we don't find anything concrete, it will cost us both dearly. Bradford won't like knowing that one of the doctors under his supervision is following leads from a nurse." "I understand, but if we're right, we'll save a life." Luke nodded, closing the chart. "Then let's find out. I'll request the tests early tomorrow morning. And Sarah, thank you for not giving up, even when everyone told you to stay quiet." She left there feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. The gears were in motion now. There was no turning back. Either she was right and Edward would be saved, or she was wrong, and she would lose everything she had built there. But as she walked through the silent corridors of the hospital, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. Because in the end, some battles are worth fighting, even when the odds seem impossible. And in room 23, Edward remained awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the woman with the attentive gaze who everyone seemed determined to ignore. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than fear and confusion. He felt hope. Monday dawned with a thin mist over Chicago, the kind of morning when the city seems to hold its breath before plunging into the chaos of the day. At St. Jude's, Sarah arrived for her shift with her stomach knotted in anxiety. She knew Dr. Luke would request the tests that morning, and from then on things would start moving quickly, for better or for worse. She found Luke already at the nursing station, reviewing Edward's chart. He nodded discreetly to her, a sign that he had moved forward with what they had discussed. Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. There was no turning back. "I've requested a full battery of specific toxicology tests," Luke said in a low voice, pretending to discuss nursing routines, "including screening for cardiac glycosides of plant origin. It'll take a few days, but if there's something there, we'll find it." "And Dr. Bradford?" Sarah asked, equally discreet. "I presented it as a differential diagnosis investigation, said I was exploring all possibilities before resorting to more invasive measures. He didn't like it, but he can't deny it makes sense from a medical standpoint." Sarah nodded, silently thanking the universe for finding in Luke someone willing to take a risk. But before she could reply, they heard firm footsteps in the corridor. Victoria Langford was arriving, punctual as always, her brown bag hanging on her arm, a polite smile on her face. But Sarah noticed something different about her that morning, a tension around her eyes, a rigidity in her shoulders, as if she sensed that something had changed. "Good morning," Victoria greeted, her voice maintaining its usual soft tone. I came to see how Edward spent the night." Sarah and Luke moved away, allowing her to head to the room, but Sarah didn't lose sight of her. She stayed close enough to observe through the cracked door. She saw Victoria approach the bed, saw the bag being opened, saw the small bottle being taken out. More juice, probably. Another dose calculated to keep Edward debilitated. But this time, something different happened. Edward, who was awake, looked at the glass Victoria was offering him and shook his head. "No, thank you. I'm not in the mood." Victoria's expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "But Edward, you need to eat. This juice has all the nutrients you need to recover." I said no. His voice, though weak, had a firmness that hadn't been there in previous days. "I'm tired of juices and teas. If you want to help me, bring water. Just that." Sarah saw Victoria's jaw tighten. The woman stood still for a long moment, the glass still in her hand, clearly not knowing how to react to the unexpected refusal. Finally, she placed the glass on the small table with more force than necessary. "As you wish. But you're being stubborn for no reason. Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm finally starting to think clearly. What is that supposed to mean?" "So it means I've spent the last few weeks accepting everything given to me without question. Perhaps it's time to start questioning." The silence that followed was charged with something dangerous. Victoria studied Edward's face, trying to understand what had changed. "Someone said something to you, didn't they?" Edward kept his gaze firm. "No one needed to say anything. I still know how to think for myself, Victoria." She took a step back, her expression closing. "Fine, I see I'm not welcome here today, but I'll be back tomorrow and I hope you'll be more reasonable." Victoria left the room without looking to either side, but Sarah saw the tension in her every step. The woman was realizing that something had changed, that the control she exercised was starting to slip, and that made her more dangerous. As soon as Victoria disappeared into the elevator, Sarah entered Edward's room. He was visibly shaken, but there was a new determination in his eyes. "She left the glass here," he said, pointing to the table. "I didn't touch it. But I don't know if I'll be able to keep refusing without her becoming completely suspicious." "You won't need to," Sarah assured him. "The tests have been requested. In a few days we'll have the proof we need." "A few days?" Edward closed his eyes briefly. "I hope we're fast enough because she won't give up. I saw it in her eyes. She's desperate." "I know. That's why we'll need to be even more careful. Don't accept anything from her, and if she insists too much, call someone from the staff. Use the call button. Don't be alone with her." Edward opened his eyes and looked at Sarah with an intensity that caught her by surprise. "Why are you doing this, risking so much for me?" Sarah hesitated. It was a fair question, and she wasn't sure if she knew the full answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said finally, "and because no one else is doing it." "But it goes beyond that, doesn't it?" Edward insisted softly. "It has to do with what happened to you, with the chance they took from you." "Perhaps." Sarah sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed, allowing herself a moment of honesty. "I spent years convincing myself that I had made peace with what happened, that I had moved on. But the truth is, a part of me never got over it, never accepted staying quiet while people with power make wrong decisions just because they can. So yes, this is personal, but it's also about you, about not letting it happen again." Edward reached out his hand, and Sarah, after a moment of hesitation, took it. His fingers were cold, weak, but the grip had meaning. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing what no one else saw, for not giving up." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. There was a connection forming between them, something that went beyond the nurse-patient relationship. It was recognition, it was complicity, and it was something more, something she wasn't ready to name yet. She gently let go of his hand and stood up. "Rest. I'll keep an eye on everything." The following days were tense. Victoria continued to appear, always with the same bag, always with offers of food and drink that Edward politely refused. The excuses varied: no appetite, preferring the hospital food, wanting to try just water for now. But Sarah saw the frustration growing in Victoria. The woman was losing her patience, and with it, her caution. On Wednesday, Sarah was making notes when she heard raised voices coming again from Edward's room. This time it was different. There was a threat in Victoria's tone, a sharp edge she no longer bothered to hide. "You don't understand the gravity of the situation, Edward. The company is on the verge of collapse without your signature on these documents. We're losing contracts. Investors are walking away. You need to act. Then bring the lawyers, bring the board. We'll have a proper meeting with witnesses, with all the necessary documentation. There's no time for that. Victoria's voice rose, losing its veneer of calm. You need to sign now, today. I'm not signing anything under pressure, especially when I'm not in full health. Your full health might never return, Edward. Have you thought about that? That maybe this is permanent? And if it is, someone needs to take command. Someone who understands the business as well as you do. And that person would be you, of course. Who else? I spent 20 years by your side building all this. I deserve to have my part recognized. Your part has always been recognized, Victoria. But total control, you never had that and you never will. The silence that followed was icy. Sarah, who had approached the door, saw Victoria close her eyes, take a deep breath, and recompose herself. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled, but there was something calculated in it. You're making a mistake, Edward. A mistake that could cost you dearly for you and everyone around you. It was a veiled threat, but a clear one. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Victoria was showing her cards, revealing that she had nothing left to lose, and that made her extremely dangerous. Victoria left the room this time without her usual composure. She passed Sarah without seeing her, her face set, her steps quick. Sarah waited until she disappeared, then entered the room. Edward was pale, his hands shaking slightly. She's getting desperate, he said, his voice low. I don't know what she's capable of when she feels cornered. That's why we need to act fast, Sarah replied. I'll talk to Dr. Luke, see if there's any way to speed up the test results. She found Luke in the cafeteria, drinking a coffee that was probably already cold. When Sarah told him about the confrontation between Edward and Victoria, he frowned, worried. That's not good. If she realizes we're investigating, she might try something more drastic. That's exactly what I'm fearing. Is there any way we can get the results faster? Luke thought for a moment. I can call the lab, mark it as urgent. Maybe we can get something by tomorrow afternoon. But Sarah, we need to be prepared for what comes next. If we confirm oleander poisoning, we'll need to involve the authorities. This goes beyond the medical scope. I know, but first we need the proof. On Thursday morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. She had slept poorly, waking up several times during the night with the feeling that something was about to happen. And when she entered the nursing station and saw the expression of one of her shift colleagues, she knew her instincts were right. Sarah, the patient in room 23. He had a crisis during the night. Severe arrhythmia, sudden drop in blood pressure. We managed to stabilize him, but it was serious. Sarah felt her blood run cold. When was this? Around 4 in the morning. The night team handled everything, but they left a note that it was the worst episode so far. Did anyone visit him before that? Did anyone bring anything? The nurse consulted the notes. There's a record of a visit at 11 at night. His partner, Victoria someone, brought some tea, said it would help him sleep better. The patient was drowsy but accepted it. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling a wave of anger and frustration. Victoria had waited until the night shift, when she knew Sarah wouldn't be there, and had managed to convince Edward, probably tired and confused, to accept what she had brought. And the result had been almost fatal. She went straight to Edward's room. He was sleeping, connected to more monitors than before, looking even more fragile. Sarah approached, adjusting the blanket, checking his vital signs, and it was then that she saw, in the trash can beside the bed, the disposable cup with residues of a dark liquid, the tea Victoria had brought. Without thinking twice, Sarah picked up the cup with a piece of gauze, placed it in a plastic bag and put it away. More proof. She was leaving the room when Edward woke up, his eyes clouded but conscious. Sarah, he murmured, his voice raspy. I drank it. She convinced me. I was so tired. I know it wasn't your fault. Sarah held his hand. But it can't happen again, do you understand? No matter what she says, no matter how she insists. Nothing from her. Nothing. Edward nodded weakly. I promise, but Sarah, I'm scared. She won't stop. She'll keep trying until she succeeds. Then we'll make sure she doesn't have any more chances. Sarah squeezed his hand firmly. Today, we're going to end this today. She found Luke immediately after, showed him the teacup, told him about the night crisis. The doctor went pale. This is an attempt at something very serious, Sarah. We can't wait for the official results anymore. I'm going to talk to Bradford right now." But Luke hesitated, and Sarah saw the doubt in his eyes. "The problem is that without concrete proof, Bradford might think we're exaggerating. He might think it's just a coincidence." "Then let's get proof he can't ignore." Sarah took a deep breath, making a decision. "I'm going to do something risky, but it will force everyone to pay attention." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to stop Victoria from administering the next dose, and I'm going to do it in front of witnesses, in a way that they can no longer pretend they don't see." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "If you do this and we're wrong, your career is over, Sarah. You know that." "I know, but if I don't do it and we're right, Edward dies, and I won't let that happen." There was a determination in her voice that left no room for doubt. Luke nodded slowly. "Then I'll be there, as a witness, and as support. If you're going to risk everything, you won't do it alone." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude, but there was no time for words. Victoria would probably show up soon, as she did every day. And when she appeared, Sarah would be ready. Ready for the confrontation that would define everything. Ready to put everything she had built there on the line. Ready to fight for the life of a man who, without her fully realizing it yet, had become much more than just a patient. Because sometimes courage isn't in knowing you're going to win. It's in deciding to fight even when the odds seem impossible. And Sarah Miller had spent too much time accepting defeat. It was time to fight back. Victoria Langford arrived at St. Jude's Medical Center shortly after noon, as she had been doing every day for the past few weeks. But on that Thursday, there was something different in her posture. Her shoulders were tenser, her smile more forced, and the brown leather bag seemed to be gripped tighter than necessary. It was the posture of someone who knew time was running out. Sarah saw her get off the elevator and walk toward the ICU corridor. Sarah's heart raced, but she maintained a calm appearance. Beside her, discreetly positioned near the nursing station, was Dr. Luke. He had agreed to be present, to be the medical witness who would give credibility to what was about to happen. And further down the hall, without Victoria having noticed yet, Dr. Bradford himself was talking to a resident, discussing routine cases. Everything was in position. Now it was a matter of timing. Victoria passed Sarah with a brief professional nod, but without really looking at her. No one really looked at nurses. Sarah had learned that a long time ago. They were part of the scenery, useful but invisible. And Victoria, accustomed to corporate environments, where hierarchies were everything, was no different. The woman entered Edward's room, and Sarah counted to 10 before approaching the door. She could see through the opening. Victoria had placed her bag on the chair and was taking out a small thermal flask, the kind used to keep liquids hot. Tea, probably. Another carefully calculated dose of oleander disguised as something harmless. Edward was awake, sitting in bed, and Sarah saw the exact moment he spotted the flask. She saw tension take over his face, the hesitation, the fear. But she also saw determination. He had promised he wouldn't accept anything else, and Sarah trusted he would keep it. "I brought chamomile tea," Victoria said, her voice maintaining its maternal tone. "It will help you relax, Edward. You look so tense." "No, thank you." Edward's voice came out firmer than Sarah expected. "I already told you I don't want anything else you bring." Victoria's hand hesitated. "Don't be childish, it's just tea." "And I said no." Sarah saw the moment Victoria's patience finally snapped. The mask of care fell away, and what remained was something cold and calculated. "You are going to drink this tea, Edward, and you are going to sign the documents I brought, because this farce has gone on long enough." "Farce?" Edward almost laughed, but it was a humorless sound. "The only farce here is you pretending you care." "I do care." Victoria took a step forward, her voice rising. "I care about everything we built, about the company, about what I spent 20 years of my life protecting while you made all the decisions and took all the credit." "So that's it." Edward's voice was low now, but heavy with painful understanding. "It's not about the company, it's about you, about resentment." "Resentment?" Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "I'd say it's about justice, about finally getting what I deserve. And to get that, you decided to poison me." The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria stood frozen, the flask still in her hand. "I don't know what you're talking about." Yes, you do. Sarah chose that moment to enter the room, her voice calm but firm. You know exactly what he's talking about, because you've been administering oleander to him for weeks. Victoria turned abruptly, her face turning livid upon seeing Sarah. Who are you to accuse me of anything? You're just a nurse. I'm the nurse who noticed what no one else wanted to see. Sarah stood firm, even with Victoria's furious gaze on her. I'm the person who observed the pattern. Every time you brought something for Mr. Sterling to consume, he got worse hours later. Every single time. Coincidence, Victoria countered, but there was panic beginning to seep into her voice. He's sick, it's obvious he's going to get worse. It's not coincidence, and it's not illness. It's systematic poisoning. Sarah took a step forward. Oleander, specifically. It causes all the symptoms he presented. Mental confusion, nausea, extreme fatigue, cardiac arrhythmias. And when administered in small repeated doses, it creates a condition that mimics a serious and progressive disease, exactly like what happened here. So you can't prove any of that, Victoria said, but her voice was trembling now. You're making absurd accusations without any basis. It was then that Luke entered the room, followed by Bradford, who had been discreetly alerted by the resident. Actually, we can prove it, Luke said, holding some papers. The specific toxicology tests I requested came back this morning. They show a significant presence of cardiac glycosides consistent with exposure to nerium oleander. Oleander. Bradford looked from the papers to Luke, then to Sarah, clearly trying to process what was happening. Luke, what exactly are you talking about? I'm talking about intentional poisoning, Dr. Bradford. Luke maintained a professional tone, but there was a firmness in him that allowed for no doubt. Nurse Miller noticed patterns that all of us ignored. A direct correlation between the consumption of food and drinks brought by Ms. Langford and the worsening of the patient's symptoms. She approached me with her observations, and we decided to investigate. The results confirm her suspicions. Bradford was silent for a long moment, and Sarah saw the exact moment his pride hit the undeniable reality of the facts. He looked at Victoria, who had backed up until she hit the wall, the tea flask still gripped in her hand. Is this true? He asked, his voice controlled but hard. Victoria didn't answer. Her face had lost all color, and her eyes moved frantically between the people in the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. It was then that Edward spoke, his voice weak but clear. She wanted control of the company. She brought documents several times, pressing me to sign power transfers. I refused. So she decided that if she couldn't get it by consent, she would get it by making me unable to resist, or by bringing me to a condition where there was no one left to make decisions except her. Victoria finally reacted, her voice coming out in a harsh whisper. You don't understand. I deserved that. I worked as hard as you. I built as much as you. But it was always your name on the contracts, your final decision. I was just the silent partner, the one who did the dirty work while you got the glory. So you poisoned me. Edward looked at her with a mixture of sadness and anger. You preferred to destroy me rather than simply ask for the recognition you thought you deserved. Ask? Victoria let out a humorless laugh. How many times did I ask, Edward? How many times did I suggest changes, more decision-making power, real participation? And how many times did you listen? The silence this time was heavy with uncomfortable truths on both sides, but Sarah couldn't let the narrative get lost in emotional issues. Regardless of the motives, she said, her voice firm, what you did was attempt to take his life in a calculated, systematic way that goes beyond any professional resentment. Bradford finally reacted, his voice gaining the authority of someone retaking control of the situation. I'm calling security, and the authorities need to be notified immediately. This is a matter beyond the medical scope. Victoria let the flask fall to the floor, the dark liquid spreading across the white tile. Her entire body seemed to have collapsed, her shoulders slumped, her face buried in her hands. I just wanted what was mine, she murmured. I just wanted to be seen. Sarah felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but she quickly pushed it away. Understanding was not excusing, and what Victoria had done was inexcusable. As for the flask that fell, Sarah said to Luke, it will need to be analyzed as well, as evidence. Luke nodded, already putting on gloves to collect the container. Security arrived minutes later, accompanied by one of the hospital administrators. Victoria was escorted out without resistance, as if all the fight had left her at once. In the corridor, patients and staff watched the scene with wide eyes, whispering among themselves, trying to understand what had happened. When they were finally alone, just Sarah, Edward, Luke, and Bradford in the room, the silence was broken by the voice of the chief doctor. "Sarah," he said, and there was something different in his tone now. Something that was perhaps respect. "You were right, and I was wrong to dismiss you the way I did." Sarah looked at him, and for a moment considered accepting the implicit apology without comment, but she decided some things needed to be said. "With all due respect, Dr. Bradford, I wasn't trying to challenge you or question your authority. I was trying to save a patient's life, and it would have been much easier to do that if I had been heard the first time." Bradford nodded his head, accepting the criticism. "You're right, and that won't happen again, at least not while I'm in command of this team." He left shortly after, along with Luke, leaving instructions for Edward to be monitored closely while the oleander was completely eliminated from his system. "The recovery will be fast now," Luke assured before leaving. "Without the source of the poisoning, your body will be able to heal." When they were finally alone, Edward reached out his hand to Sarah. She approached and took it, feeling the grip still weak but determined. "You saved my life," he said, his eyes shining with an emotion that went beyond gratitude. "Literally. And you did it when no one else believed in you." "I did what needed to be done." "You did much more than that. You challenged an entire system. You risked your career, your reputation, everything for me, someone you barely knew." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. It was no longer true that she barely knew him. In the last few weeks, through the brief conversations, the shared looks, the joint fight for the truth, she had come to know him in a deep way. She knew his strength, his vulnerability, his refusal to accept injustice even when he was too weak to fight. And at some point, without her fully realizing exactly when, he had ceased to be just a patient and had become something more. "I couldn't let you die," she said simply, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "Not when I knew I could stop it." Edward lightly pulled her hand, making Sarah sit on the edge of the bed. There was something in his eyes now, an intensity that made her hold her breath. "In the last few days," he said, "confused and weak as I was, there was one thing that kept me safe. It was knowing you were around, that you were observing, that you cared enough not to let anything go unnoticed. Sarah, you didn't just save my life. You made me remember that there are still people in the world who fight for what is right, regardless of the cost, who don't accept ready-made answers, who see beyond the obvious." He raised his other hand, hesitant, and lightly touched her face. Sarah should have moved away, she knew that. There were protocols, limits, unwritten rules about relationships between patients and health professionals. But the moment his fingers touched her skin, all those rules seemed distant and irrelevant. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice coming out in a whisper. "I'm saying that when I get out of here, when I recover completely, I'd like to get to know you for real, not as patient and nurse, but as two people who went through something extraordinary together and discovered there's something more between them." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to feel what she had been denying. The attraction that had grown in the midst of danger, the connection that had formed through mutual trust, the desire that had developed when she least expected it. "You're vulnerable right now," she said, even though she knew it wasn't just vulnerability between them. "Emotionally, physically. Perhaps when you're better, when you go back to your life, you'll realize this was just the context, the intensity of the situation. Or perhaps," Edward replied, holding her hand firmly, "I'll realize it was the situation that allowed me to see clearly what I never would have noticed in normal circumstances, that you are exceptional, Sarah, and that I would be an idiot if I let you walk out of my life without at least trying." Sarah opened her eyes and met his gaze. There was truth there, sincerity and something more, a promise of possibilities she didn't yet dare to name. "Then let's wait," she said finally. "Let's wait for you to recover completely. Return to your life. And if you still feel the same, if you still want to know me beyond these hospital corridors, then we'll talk." Edward smiled, and it was the first true smile Sarah had seen on him since he had arrived at the hospital weeks ago. "It's a deal, but I warn you, I'm stubborn, and when I decide I want something, I don't give up easily." "I noticed," Sarah said, allowing herself to smile too. "After all, you survived weeks of poisoning. I imagine there's not much capable of bringing you down." He laughed, a weak but genuine sound, and Sarah felt something release inside her, something that had been tight for a long time. Hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, life could still surprise her in good ways. She stayed there a few more minutes, talking about simple things, about recovery plans, about what he would do when he left the hospital. And for the first time in weeks, neither of them mentioned illnesses, symptoms, or dangers. For the first time, they talked just as two people who were discovering there was something special forming between them. When Sarah finally left the room, she found Luke waiting in the corridor. He looked at her with a knowing smile. "Everything okay in there?" "Everything's fine," Sarah confirmed, feeling her face heat up slightly. "He's going to recover." "I'm sure he will," Luke laughed softly. "And I'm sure you'll continue to closely monitor that recovery." "Someone needs to do it," Sarah replied, trying to look professional but failing to completely hide her smile. "Of course, someone needs to." Luke patted her on the shoulder. "You did an incredible job, Sarah, truly. You saved a life. And you proved that intuition and observation are worth as much as any diploma." Sarah nodded, grateful not only for the words but for the support he had given when she needed it most. "Thank you for trusting me, for taking the risk too. It was worth it. It's always worth it when we do what's right." That night, when she finished her shift, Sarah walked through the corridors of St. Jude's with a different feeling. She was no longer the invisible nurse, the one who always stayed in the background. She was the woman who had saved a life, who had faced a system, who had proven her value, and who perhaps had found something more in the process, something that could change her life in ways she couldn't yet fully imagine. And in room 23, Edward Sterling slept for the first time in weeks without fear, without pain, without poison running through his veins. He slept knowing he was safe, and that when he woke up, the path ahead of him would be one of recovery, of truth, of justice, and of a possibility he hadn't expected to find but that he now refused to let escape. The days following the revelation brought rapid and profound changes. Edward began to recover with a speed that surprised even the most experienced doctors at St. Jude's. Without the constant source of poisoning, his body reacted exactly as Luke had predicted. Color returned to his face, strength to his hands, clarity to his eyes. It was like seeing someone rising from the ashes, being reborn. Sarah followed every step of this transformation, not just as a nurse, though she continued to be the attentive and competent professional she always was, but as someone who had invested much more than just technical skills in that recovery. There was emotion there, care that went beyond the protocol, a connection that became more evident every day. On Tuesday, a week after the confrontation, Edward was sitting in the armchair by the window, reviewing company reports that he finally had medical authorization to look over. Sarah entered to check his vital signs and found him focused, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was an image so different from the pale and confused man she had met weeks ago that for a moment she simply stopped to observe. "Do you like what you see?" Edward asked without looking up from the papers, but with a smile playing on his lips. Sarah felt her face heat up. "I was evaluating your recovery. You look much better. I feel much better." Edward finally looked at her, and there was a brightness in his eyes that made her heart race. "Thanks to you. Thanks to modern medicine, and the fact that we identified the problem in time." "Always so modest," he observed, putting the papers aside. "Sit here with me, just for a few minutes." Sarah hesitated, looking at the door. "I'm on duty. 5 minutes, please." She gave in, sitting in the chair next to his. Edward reached out his hand, and this time Sarah took it without hesitation. His fingers were warm now, firm, so different from the weakness she had felt before. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about everything that happened, about Victoria, about the company, about how I let things get to this point. It's not your fault what she did. Not directly, but I failed to see the signs. Her resentment had been growing for years, and I chose to ignore it. I thought loyalty and hard work were enough. I didn't realize she needed more than that. She needed real recognition, an active voice in decisions. Sarah lightly squeezed his hand. That doesn't justify what she did. Nothing justifies it. I know. And she will answer for it. The lawyers are already taking care of everything, but still it made me think about how I treat the people around me, about who I really see and who I choose to ignore. He looked at her with an intensity that made Sarah hold her breath. You, for example, you were here the whole time, observing, understanding, seeing things no one else saw, and I almost ignored you too. I almost made the same mistake I made with Victoria, but in a different way, underestimating someone just because they didn't hold the position I thought was important. You were sick, Sarah reminded him softly, and being poisoned. You weren't in a condition to see much. But the others were. Bradford was, the whole medical team was, and yet it was you and Luke, the people with the least power in the hierarchy, who saved my life. Edward leaned forward slightly. That taught me something. It taught me that value isn't about titles or positions. It's about character, about courage, about doing what's right even when it's costly. Sarah felt her eyes sting slightly. Thank you for understanding that. I'm the one who should thank you for showing me. Edward held both her hands now. And for making me want to be a better person, someone who really sees the people around them, someone worthy of having someone like you by their side. Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and one of the younger nurses entered, stopping abruptly upon seeing the scene. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sarah stood up quickly, letting go of Edward's hands perhaps faster than necessary. You're not interrupting, I was just going back to work. She left without looking back, but she could feel Edward's eyes on her, and she could also feel the smile on her own face, stubborn and persistent, that refused to disappear. That afternoon, Sarah was called to the office of the hospital's administrative director. She entered prepared for the worst, but found, besides the director, Dr. Bradford and 2 other members of senior management. To her surprise, everyone was smiling. Sarah, the director began, gesturing for her to sit, we wanted to talk to you about the recent events and about your future here at St. Jude's. Sarah sat, her hands clenched in her lap. I understand. First, we want to formalize our recognition for what you did. Your observations, your persistence, and your courage saved a patient's life and exposed an extremely serious situation that could have resulted in something much worse. The director pushed some papers across the desk. We are offering you a promotion, supervisor of the intensive care unit, with a corresponding salary increase and authority to implement new observation and reporting protocols. Sarah looked at the documents, then at Bradford. He nodded, and there was something that looked like genuine regret in his eyes. You deserve this, Sarah, and much more. Your work here has always been impeccable, but what you demonstrated in recent weeks was exceptional. The ability for observation, critical thinking, the courage to challenge hierarchies when necessary. These are qualities we need to encourage, not suppress. Furthermore, the director continued, Mr. Sterling contacted us. He is making a significant donation to the hospital with one specific condition. Part of the amount will be destined to create a scholarship program for nursing professionals who wish to specialize or complete medical training. And he requested that you be the first beneficiary, if you are interested. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. A scholarship. The chance to return to medicine to complete what had been interrupted so many years ago. It was as if all the doors that had closed were suddenly opening again. I don't know what to say. Say you accept, Bradford suggested with a half-smile, because frankly it would be a waste to see someone with your clinical reasoning capacity limited by a lack of opportunities. Sarah picked up the papers with hands trembling slightly. I accept both the promotion and the scholarship, and I thank you sincerely. When she left that room, Sarah had to lean against the corridor wall for a moment, processing everything. Her life was changing in ways she hadn't dared to dream. And at the center of all this was Edward Sterling, a man who had entered her life in the most unexpected way possible and was transforming everything. Edward was medically discharged on Friday of that week. Sarah was present when he signed the discharge papers, when he said goodbye to the medical team, when he personally thanked Luke for the support. And she was there too when he stopped at the door of the room, looked at her and said simply, I'll see you soon. It wasn't a question, it was a promise. In the days that followed, Sarah plunged into her new position. There was much to do, protocols to revise, teams to organize, a new role to assume. But always in the back of her mind was the question, would Edward really reach out? Or when he returned to his real life, to his business and responsibilities, did he realize that what he felt in the hospital was just gratitude confused with something more? The answer came on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after his discharge. Sarah was reviewing charts when one of the receptionists called the nursing station. "Sarah, there's someone down here asking for you. He said it's personal." Sarah's heart raced. "I'll be down in 5 minutes." When she arrived at the hospital's main lobby, she found Edward waiting. He looked different, wearing an impeccable suit, his hair well cut, his posture erect and confident. He was the successful businessman she had only caught a glimpse of before, now fully recovered. And yet when his eyes met hers, it was the same intensity, the same warmth, the same connection. "Hi," he said, smiling. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "I'm on break," Sarah replied, trying to control her racing heart. "How are you?" "Completely recovered. I went back to work this week. It's been intense, reorganizing everything after weeks away. But necessary." Edward took a step closer. "But I didn't come here to talk about work. I came because I made a promise. I said that when I recovered, when I went back to my life, I would find you, and here I am." Sarah felt a smile form on her face. "Here you are. So would you like to have dinner with me? Tonight? Nothing related to hospitals, illnesses, or poisons, just two people getting to know each other for real." Sarah knew she should hesitate, consider all the implications, think about protocols and prudence. But looking at Edward, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, feeling the strength of that connection that had formed in the midst of chaos, she decided she had already been too cautious in life. She had already let fear dictate her choices for too long. "I'd love to." The smile Edward gave could have lit up the entire lobby. "Great, I'll pick you up at 7. I'll be ready." When he left, Sarah stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then she turned and saw Luke watching from afar, a knowing smile on his face. "Not a word," she warned, but she couldn't hide her own smile. "I don't need to say anything," Luke replied. "Your face says it all." That night, Sarah got ready with a care she hadn't taken in years. She chose a simple but elegant dress, left her hair down, and applied light makeup. When Edward rang the doorbell at exactly 7, she took a deep breath before opening the door. His expression when he saw her was worth every second of preparation. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice heavy with genuine admiration. "Thank you, you look good too." They had dinner at a discreet but sophisticated restaurant, a place where they could talk without interruptions. And they talked about everything, about their childhoods, about dreams and disappointments, about what had brought them to that point. Edward told her about how he built his company from scratch, about the sacrifices he made, about the loneliness that came with success. Sarah spoke about being expelled from medical school, about the years rebuilding her life, about the pain of having a dream stolen and the strength needed to move forward. And the more they talked, the more they realized how much they had in common. Both had been underestimated. Both had fought against systems that discarded them. Both had refused to give up, even when it would have been easier. There was a mutual understanding there, a deep empathy that went beyond physical attraction or gratitude. When the night ended and Edward drove her back home, they stayed in the car for a long moment, just talking, reluctant to leave that intimate space they had created. "Can I see you again?" Edward finally asked. "Tomorrow? Or is that too fast?" Sarah laughed softly. "Considering you were on the brink of death and I helped save you, I think we surpassed the concept of too fast a long time ago." "Good point. So tomorrow?" "Tomorrow." Edward leaned in, hesitant, giving her space to pull back if she wanted. But Sarah didn't want to. She closed the distance between them, and their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and intense, a promise and a revelation. When they separated, both were smiling. Sarah entered her house that night feeling as if she were floating. For the first time in a long time, the future seemed full of bright possibilities. The promotion, the scholarship, and now Edward, a man who truly saw her, who valued her strength and intelligence, who wanted to know her not despite who she was, but exactly because of it. Meanwhile, in his apartment across the city, Edward was making plans. Plans that involved not only his company but also St. Jude's Medical Center. He had talked to his lawyers, to his executive team. He wanted to make real changes, implement programs that valued professionals like Sarah, that recognized that excellence could come from anywhere, not just from those with the most impressive diplomas. And he wanted to do all this with Sarah by his side, not as a passive beneficiary of his generosity, but as a partner, an equal, someone whose opinion and perspective he valued as much as his own, perhaps even more, because she had something he had lost over the years, the ability to see beyond the obvious, to question the established, to fight for what was right even when it was costly. Days turned into weeks, and the relationship between them flourished. Dinners became walks, walks became weekends together, and with every moment, the connection deepened. It wasn't just romance, though there was undeniable chemistry between them. It was partnership, it was mutual respect. It was the feeling of having found someone who truly understood, who saw the world in a similar way, who shared fundamental values. Sarah began her medical classes, resuming studies she had abandoned years ago. It was challenging to balance the new position at the hospital with her studies, but Edward was always there, offering support when she needed it, celebrating every small victory, reminding her of what she was capable of when insecurity hit. And Edward, for his part, was changing too, becoming more open, more willing to listen, more aware of the people around him. The company was prospering, not despite the changes he had implemented, but because of them. Employees felt more valued, more heard, and that was reflected in productivity and loyalty. 3 months after his discharge from the hospital, Edward organized a special meeting at St. Jude's. He invited the administration, the medical team, and especially Sarah. When everyone was gathered, he announced the creation of the Veritas Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting transparency, critical observation, and the valuation of health professionals at all levels. The foundation would offer scholarships, training programs, and support for those who, like Sarah, had been underestimated but demonstrated exceptional competence. Sarah was in the audience, tears in her eyes, seeing the man she had helped save now using his influence to create real and lasting change. And when he finished his speech and his eyes met hers across the room, she knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. Because sometimes the deepest connections are born in the most unlikely places, and the most beautiful stories begin not with ease, but with struggle, with courage, and with two people deciding it's worth risking everything for what is right, and for who is right to be by your side. 6 months had passed since that morning. Sarah Miller had first seen Edward Sterling, pale and debilitated, being wheeled into room 23. 6 months that seemed to have lasted a lifetime, so intense and transformative the changes had been. Sarah was sitting in her new office, the plate on the door identifying her as the ICU supervisor, reviewing the week's reports. But her thoughts kept returning to the ceremony that would take place that night, an event that would symbolically mark the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. Victoria Langford's case had followed its course through the legal system. After weeks of investigation, authorities had gathered enough evidence of what she had done. Confronted with irrefutable evidence, toxicology analyses, testimonies, and her own partial confession at the hospital, Victoria had accepted a plea deal. She would be permanently removed from any corporate leadership position, have to undergo specialized counseling, and face appropriate consequences for her actions. There was no going back. The woman who had once been a powerful partner in one of Chicago's most influential companies now faced the reality of having lost everything by choosing the wrong path. Edward had followed the process with mixed feelings. There was anger, of course, for the betrayal, for the danger he had faced, for the months stolen from his life. But there was also a painful understanding of his own part in creating that environment, of how he had failed to see and properly value the people around him. It was a lesson he would carry forever. Sarah heard soft knocking on the door and looked up. It was Luke, smiling conspiratorially. "Ready for tonight?" "As ready as I can be," Sarah replied, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "It's strange, isn't it? After everything that's happened, I still get nervous about public events." "It's because you care, and because you know what you're going to say will matter to a lot of people." Luke sat in the chair across from her desk. You changed this place, Sarah, truly. The way the team interacts, how we treat observations from nurses, how we value different perspectives, all of that came from you. It came from doing what was right, and from having you by my side when I needed it. Always, Luke assured her. And speaking of which, I heard you're finishing the first semester with excellent grades. Medicine agrees with you. Sarah smiled. It does. It's strange to be back after all these years, but it's as if a part of me that was dormant has finally woken up. And this time, I know no one can take it from me, because I earned it on my own merit. They talked for a few more minutes before Luke left, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts again. She looked at the clock. Edward would pick her up in a few hours for the ceremony. They had agreed to go together, as they did with almost everything now. The relationship between them had evolved in ways Sarah never would have imagined possible. It wasn't just romance, though there was deep and true love between them. It was partnership in the most complete sense of the word. Edward consulted her on important company decisions, especially those involving people and organizational culture. Sarah, in turn, had in Edward a safe harbor, someone who believed in her unconditionally, who supported her without suffocating her, who celebrated her achievements as if they were his own. They had faced together the curious looks, the whispered comments about how the relationship had started, the inevitable questions about social and economic differences, but none of that mattered, because what they had was real. Built not on convenience or superficiality, but on truth, respect, and a connection that had been forged in the fire of adversity. That afternoon, while getting ready for the ceremony, Sarah thought about all the versions of herself she had been. The medical student full of dreams, the young woman unjustly expelled, carrying shame she didn't deserve, the nursing technician who started from zero, the competent but invisible nurse, and now the respected supervisor, the medical student once again, the woman loved by an extraordinary man. All those versions were there, layers of experience and growth that had made her who she was. And for the first time Sarah felt complete, not because she had reached a status or position, but because she had proven herself, had fought for what she believed in, and had won not by destroying others but by staying true to her values. Edward arrived punctually as always. When Sarah opened the door, he stood for a moment, just looking at her with that expression that still made her heart race. "You look stunning," he said, offering his arm. "You don't look so bad yourself," Sarah teased, accepting his arm and letting him lead her to the car. The ceremony took place at St. Jude's itself, in the main auditorium. It was the official launch of the Veritas Foundation, but also a celebration of broader changes. The hospital had implemented new protocols based on Edward's case, ensuring that observations from any team member, regardless of position, were taken seriously and properly investigated. It had created more open communication channels, mentoring programs, and an institutional commitment to excellence that went beyond diplomas and titles. When Sarah went up on stage to speak, as one of the founders of the new initiative, she looked at the audience and saw familiar faces. Bradford was there, and there was genuine respect in his eyes now. Luke, always present, smiled encouragingly. Nurses and technicians she had worked alongside for years looked at her with pride, seeing in her the proof that it was possible to grow, change, and make a difference. And there in the back, Edward, always Edward, her biggest supporter, her partner, her love. Sarah began to speak, her voice firm and clear. "A few months ago I was just another nurse in this hospital, competent, dedicated, but essentially invisible to anyone who didn't really want to see. And then something happened that changed everything. Not because I changed who I was, but because I finally had the chance to show what I had always been capable of doing." She told the story, edited and appropriate for the audience, about observation, perseverance, and the importance of listening to all voices in a medical environment. She spoke about how she had almost given up, almost stayed quiet, almost accepted being ignored, and about how deciding to fight, even against all odds, had saved a life and changed many others. "The Veritas Foundation exists because we all understand that excellence can come from anywhere," Sarah continued. "That the best ideas don't always come from those with the most impressive titles, but from those with the most attentive eyes, the most open minds, and the courage to speak up when they see something wrong. We are here to ensure that no one else is ignored just because they don't hold the right position, that everyone has the chance to show their value. The applause was enthusiastic and prolonged, but what touched Sarah most was seeing among the audience tears on some faces. Younger nurses who saw in her an example, technicians who finally felt valued, residents who learned that arrogance never replaces genuine attention to patients. After the ceremony, as people mingled at the cocktail reception, Edward found Sarah in a quieter corner. "You were incredible," he said, taking her hand in his. "I was nervous. It didn't show. You sounded confident, articulate, inspiring." Edward pulled her slightly closer. "Do you know what I realized watching you up there on stage?" "What?" "That I fell in love not just with the woman who saved my life, but with the woman who is saving the lives of so many other people, changing systems, inspiring change, making a real difference in the world." Sarah felt her eyes sting. "Edward, Wait," he interrupted gently. "Let me finish, because there's something I've been wanting to ask you for weeks, but I was waiting for the right moment. And now, seeing you like this, fulfilled, brilliant, exactly where you should be, I feel it's the time." He knelt down and Sarah felt her heart stop. Around them, people began to realize what was happening, conversations stopping, looks turning toward them. But Sarah could only see Edward, his eyes fixed on hers, full of love and certainty. "Sarah Miller, you saved me in so many ways. You saved my life, obviously, but you also saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be, someone blind to what really matters. You showed me that courage isn't about power or position, it's about doing the right thing even when it costs everything. That love isn't about convenience, it's about true partnership." He took a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a delicate but stunning ring. "Will you marry me? Be my partner not just in the fights and achievements we've already faced, but in all those yet to come. Build a life with me, a life based on truth, respect, and true love." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she said, her voice coming out in an emotional whisper. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Edward stood up and slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her in for a kiss while the room around them exploded in applause and celebrations. And in that moment, Sarah felt as if all the pieces of her life had finally fallen into place. The pains of the past had brought lessons, the struggles had brought strength, and everything, absolutely everything, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In the months that followed, Sarah and Edward planned a simple but meaningful wedding. Nothing ostentatious, nothing designed to impress. Just the people who really mattered, in a moment that celebrated not only their union, but everything they had overcome to get there. Luke was the best man. The hospital staff attended in full, and when Sarah walked down the aisle toward Edward, wearing an elegant but discreet dress, she wasn't thinking about social protocols or expectations. She was thinking about journeys, about how life had strange ways of leading us exactly where we need to be, even when the path seems impossible. Edward waited for her at the altar with tears in his eyes, and when they exchanged vows, they were words they had written together. Promises not just of love, but of partnership, of mutual support, of fighting together for a better world, of never stopping to see value in people regardless of position, of always choosing courage over convenience, of building something that mattered, not just for them, but for everyone around them. The party that followed was joyful and relaxed. Sarah danced with Edward, with Luke, with colleagues from the hospital. She laughed until her stomach hurt, ate cake until she couldn't anymore, and allowed herself to be completely happy in a way she hadn't allowed herself in years. And when the night ended, when she and Edward were finally alone, driving to the honeymoon they had planned, Sarah looked out the window at the city of Chicago lighting up in the night and thought about everything that had happened, about how an apparently impossible case at the hospital had turned into the most important story of her life. She thought about Victoria, and felt not anger but a deep sadness for someone who had chosen the wrong path. She thought about Bradford and how even the most stubborn people could learn and change. She thought about Luke and how unexpected alliances could save lives. And she thought about herself, all the versions she had been and who she was becoming. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked, briefly taking her hand. "About journeys," Sarah replied. about how sometimes we need to go through the fire to discover what we're really made of, and about how it's worth it. All the fear, all the struggle, all the pain. It's worth it when it leads you to where you're meant to be. Edward brought her hand to his lips, kissing it lightly. With the right people by your side, it's always worth it. And Sarah knew with the deep certainty that comes from lived experience that he was right. That despite everything she had faced, the losses and humiliations and moments of despair, she wouldn't change a thing, because everything had been necessary to bring her there, to make her strong enough to fight, wise enough to recognize value, courageous enough to risk, and open enough to accept love when it finally arrived. Months turned into years, and the life Sarah and Edward built together went beyond anything they could have imagined. The Veritas Foundation expanded, helping hundreds of health professionals reach their full potential. Sarah completed her medical training, becoming not just a doctor, but one of the most respected voices in clinical observation and the valuation of multidisciplinary teams. Edward transformed his company into a model of healthy corporate culture, where all voices were heard and merit was recognized regardless of hierarchy. Together, they became examples that it is possible to be successful without compromising values, that it is possible to lead with empathy, that it is possible to build something meaningful based on truth and respect. And every night when they returned home to the space they built together, they remembered where they had started. From room 23 of St. Jude's Medical Center, from the moment a nurse decided not to stay quiet, from the instant a businessman decided to listen, from the exact point where two lives crossed in an unexpected way and changed forever. Because in the end, the best stories are not about ease or luck. They are about courage, about choosing the difficult when it would be simpler to give up, about seeing value where others see invisibility, about fighting for what is right even when the odds seem impossible, and about finding in the midst of chaos and struggle something precious and true that makes it all worth it. Sarah and Edward built a life based on these truths, and whenever anyone asked them the secret, the answer was simple. Never underestimate the power of really seeing people, of listening to the voices that are ignored, of giving chances to those who were discarded. Because sometimes, the person everyone ignores is exactly the one who has what it takes to change everything. And sometimes, in the most unlikely place at the most difficult moment in the midst of the greatest adversity, you find not only the solution to the problem in front of you, but also the person you were destined to walk beside for the rest of your life. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Sarah and Edward has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by the journey of this courageous nurse who saved a life and found true love, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most in this story. Was it Sarah's courage in facing the system, Edward's awakening to the value of the people around him, or the romance that was born from the fight for truth?